Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you're joining us for this. Well, it's a clinic, but there are so many of you. It's probably something greater than a clinic. I think this morning it's probably closer to a webinar. I'm just going to briefly give you the slide with my conflicts of interest, but they're all pretty tame. I've got nothing commercial up my sleeves. I'm employed by Cochrane. That's the only financial interest I have basically from all of this. And I'm going to start with probably a question that may well have prompted so many of you to join us to go through this question, which is why these sections, research implications, so important. Well, at times like this, it's always worth trying to find a quote or an article from Doug Altman. And I think the most iconic, the most famous quote that we can attribute to Doug came from his editorial in the BJ from 1994 on the scandal of poor medical research. And it's that first sentence which I think has sort of really become something of a legacy for Doug, and a real reminder of just how, given this is what, 27 years ago, 28 years ago, it's a real reminder and a real problem, I guess, that it's still relevant today, that we don't necessarily always need more research, but we do need better research, and we need research done for the right reasons. And what was prompting him wasn't just sort of the quality of medical research as he saw it, but a quite fundamental issue about research waste, which I think continues to haunt us to this day. So they're important sections to write, but the problem is they happen to be some of the most difficult. Now, most biostatisticians I know tell me that pie charts are notoriously misleading. And they're an act of cruelty to inflict them on anybody that sees them. The reason why I'm prepared to live with that stinging criticism of pie charts is because I think this one in particular tells us two great inconvenient truths about writing up research. This was taken from a survey that had been run by PLOS. They did a survey of their authors, asking them which bits they found hardest to write. And I don't know if this chimes with your experience, but it certainly chimes with mine. The two bits, in this case, the title also seems problematic. We don't have that issue in Cochrane, but certainly the two bits that I think trouble most people that I know who've gone through writing reviews are the abstract, so the summary version of what we're doing. But interestingly, also the conclusions, which are represented by the segment on the left-hand side of this particular pie chart. So we then might ask ourselves, why is it so hard to write? We know they're important, but they're also really difficult. And I've come up with three reasons why I think they're difficult. I think when we're doing systematic reviews, this is probably an issue maybe more with Cochrane reviews because of the scope that we often have, but we end up addressing multiple questions. And that means that the evidence we find variably fits the question that we're interested in. So in other words, you get this sort of issue where studies may be piling up or accumulating in a particular part of the question or comparison of interest. And that doesn't always align well with every PICO, every question that we're addressing in a review. So we have an issue of scope, but we also have an issue of where the evidence is lining up. And that can be difficult to think about and reflect on because of the variation of fit. We also have numerous outputs as well. Lots of plots, lots of tables, high reporting requirement, presentation of data in numerous formats. We have, not only do we have forest plots, but we may well have information that's not sitting inside the plots or the tables that we still need to try and reflect on. And the last sort of great truth, I think, is that pointing out something that's broken is often a lot easier than knowing how to fix it. And I think this is where I'm very happy to say that Cochrane reviews, I'm going to be, I've always tried to be positive, and I was thinking ways that I need to sort of rein that in for this morning. But actually, I think this is actually quite a good news story that I want to share with you. And that's about how recent Cochrane reviews are tackling the implications for a research issue. So many years ago, when I sort of first joined up, there seemed to be a common caricature of research implication sections in Cochrane reviews, which essentially just said, oh, more research is required. I'm quite pleased to be able to say that I think that age is pretty much over. I looked at, as you can see, 12 reviews from one of the recent issues of the Cochrane Library, just to sort of see what was going on with these sections, how people were tackling them, you know, what sort of practices were there. And as you can see, the average word count in that section was about 300 words, which is, you know, quite a lot to say more research is required. But actually, what was coming through from those sections is that the generic requests for more research are much less frequent. And there is, I think, a pronounced move towards better direction on what kind of questions future research needs to address. So I don't know if this is correlation or causation, but I'm gonna put this up so you can see. This is the guidance that we put together in the reporting chapter of the Cochrane Handbook. Really, this is a good news story in about 80 words. Okay, so the 80 words that I've put together here are highlighted in this particular section. Identify 3 practices, 3 things that I think have made a difference. Now, I don't know, as I said, correlation, causation. I don't know if people have paid attention to this bit in the guidance, or when we were thinking about this, whether subconsciously some of these things that I'd seen in previous research implications section had just floated into my head and you know, came out into this bit of the guidance. So so I can't really claim any credit for that, but I think the view that I think I share with some of the things that I've seen, you know, some of the teams who've put together their reviews recently, is that we're guided by a basic principle, which is we're about reducing waste, right? So we've got to use what we've learned from doing the review to identify priorities for future research. And it comes down to asking ourselves 3 questions. How applicable is the evidence we have to the population, intervention, comparison, and outcomes of interest? What are the impacts on the certainty of the evidence? And the last point, which I think I think was never quite embraced fully until more recent times. What do we know about ongoing research? The answers to those 3 things are fantastic material for writing research implications. So let's break this down. Let's look at that first point about assessing the applicability against PICO. And as you can see in the text that I've highlighted just on the screen, this is about how people reflect on the gaps in the evidence, but doing it in that bit in the discussion section called completeness and applicability. This is an opportunity for you to give some indication as to how good the fit is between the evidence you found and the question that you were interested in the first place. And this helps to crystallize where studies have landed in relation to your review question and what they haven't addressed so far. So this is a model of how a PICO can set up a number of comparisons in a systematic review that crucially go through the entire process. So when we're putting together a protocol for a review, we're thinking about eligible populations, interventions, comparisons, and outcomes. I think the trick is to try and, as early as possible, identify those comparisons, because they really help you set up a framework for addressing the particular objectives of the review through the entire process. So keep that from the protocol onwards. You need to preserve that through the process. Because by the time you're coming to think about what questions the studies have addressed and where they fit in the review, the chances are they'll be sitting, I always like to think within the sort of tram lines, within the parameters, but the truth is they often sit somewhat outside them, or they straddle the sort of parameters for comparisons, your population intervention comparisons and outcomes that you're interested in doing the review. And it's this sort of this profile of where evidence sits in relation to the question of interest for your review that actually is a superb feeding ground for how future research can help plug those gaps. So this is the example I'm going to show you is from a review that published in December of last year, and it's on different transfusion thresholds for guiding red blood cell transfusion by Jeffrey Carson and colleagues. And what I noted with this particular example is the sort of setting up a question, setting up eligibility criteria that help you through pretty much the entire process. So there was a nice thread through the rationale for the review, where in the background section, they talk about the causes of anemia, which are diverse, and note that surgery could be one of those reasons, or it's a consequence of medical illness. When they set the eligibility criteria, that population remained broad. So they included trials of surgical or medical participants, adults or children were both eligible. By the time they were writing about they were describing the studies that were relevant to the review, they noted some variation in the clinical context of the trials that were eligible, and I've just highlighted the ones picking out orthopedic surgery, critical care, and acute blood loss. And that really helps to formulate the completeness and applicability section of the discussion section, because what we can see here is that they're reflecting on the applicability of what they've got. So they thought about maybe the parameters of that population, how broad it was initially. But what they began to notice and began to work through here that they know that there are gaps. They've spotted where there are gaps. And actually, when they wrote the implications for research section, they carried that knowledge through and they threaded it through into the implications for research. And they noted where there was a particular need for trials looking at those two strategies for guiding blood cell transfusions, not least in cardiovascular disease, but brain injury and stroke and acute coronary syndrome. So population is one element where you may find gaps. Another, of course, is outcomes. And it's often the case that when you look through the analysis of a set of analyses for a systematic review, you'll see a large number of sparsely populated analyses. And that really can help you, I think. It may not help you in terms of determining implications of practice, but it helps you, I think, to understand the sort of the diverse way that studies in a particular area are measuring outcomes of interest. And it's one of the reasons why core outcome sets are an incredibly useful mechanism to help people not just design studies, but when you're thinking about systematic reviews, you're thinking about outcomes of interest. It helps sort of, helps you judge where the studies are in relation to the core outcomes. And this is an example of one where they reference core outcome sets in the implications for research. And this is a review that published just in January by Sharon Lewis and colleagues looking at cephalomedullary and extramedullary implants for extracapsular hip fractures in older adults, which is easy for me to say, I know, but it basically is different ways of fixing bones with long metal pins. And in the implications for research, they noted that it was important to raise awareness. So it's a nice way to kind of draw attention to particular issues and to encourage uptake of things like core outcome sets, because it's a message to study investigators, and it's interesting to think that in this particular example, the core outcome set of interest was actually published 8 years ago. And to date, few studies have actually considered it and embraced it. So a nice sort of way to encourage better uptake of core outcome sets, not just have it in the review, not just set up your own analyses, but where if they fall short, to remind people of the importance of things like So let's go back to the model of a review of PICO and the studies that are assembled in it. Once we've included them, we then have to appraise them. We do a meta-analysis, and we rate certainty of evidence and do our grade assessments. And this brings me to the second point about using what's impacting on the certainty of evidence to inform future research. And I've highlighted the second section as well. As you can see, this is any factors that led to the downgrading as part of the grade assessment, and that could provide useful suggestions. And it's quite interesting, I think, when you see implications for research section where maybe it tends towards the bland and the generic. We want studies at a low risk of bias. That's quite a hard ask. I think it's going a little bit beyond that, which is why I think when people are populating footnotes for a summary of findings table, that they think quite carefully about what is it that would help you restore that downgrading decision, restore that certainty in the evidence. And this was a nice example from January, looking at indoor residual insecticide spraying to prevent malaria by Joseph Price, Nancy Medley, and Leslie Choi. And this was particularly in relation to a downgrading decision for inconsistency. And they noted that there was variation between the results of the studies, and they pinged it for inconsistency accordingly. And then when you come to the implications for research section, that gave them a nice carrot or a nice nugget to work with here. Which is essentially drawing attention to the fact that there was variation between the results of the studies, and there's uncertainty over whether the intervention will be effective in all settings. And they then go on to give some direction as to how people may be able to generate evidence that might help explain that variation. So in other words, don't just leave the grade assessments locked in the footnotes of the summary of findings table. Look for avenues for them to come out, and the implications for research section is one such place. So as if this model wasn't complicated enough, we also have the issue of ongoing studies and where they live in relation to the review. And I don't think this was something that was always in people's minds, but I think as time's gone by and as trial registration has increased, and study registries are there's an expectation that they're searched in for Cochrane reviews, and that is for a very good reason. And there may be in future clinics for us to come back and talk about the value of ongoing studies, but I just want to reflect on them quite specifically for the implications for research section today. So this is about drawing on what we know about ongoing studies to help identify whether new studies need to be initiated. And if you think back to an implications for practice section that may be laced, absolutely riddled with uncertainty, lots of very low certainty evidence, you think, wow, okay, new studies desperately needed, and this is how they should be done. But it's always worth stopping to look at the list of ongoing studies, because it may well be that somebody's already on the case, or teams of researchers already on the case. And so I think it's quite a useful moment to reflect not just on the studies that you've got and the certainty of evidence that you have right there today. It's also an important moment to look at whether any ongoing studies are going to help to address that gap, because it could even be you could have a situation where it's not a good idea to initiate new research until the ongoing studies have completed and their results are available to you. The other thing I think that's very useful when looking through ongoing studies which can be relevant for your review is to also be thinking about an indicative timeline for updates. So the idea is that not only do you're able to ground implications for research based on what you know about the ongoing studies, but it's also a useful marker to think through when studies are likely to complete, when their results might be available. You could even enter a dialogue with the study investigators to ascertain all of that. And that will help you plan, I think, the future versions of the review when you might need to come back to the well and look for more evidence. And this was a really good example, actually, of how somebody used ongoing studies to really fine-tune where the priorities were for research. And this was from Neil O'Connell, looking at implanted spinal neuromodulation interventions for chronic pain in adults, which I think is actually the featured review on the homepage of the Cochrane Library today. And this was what I really liked about this was how they exploited the intel they gathered on the ongoing studies. And not only that, but they looked at how well the studies were done, and they sort of looked at the similarity of what they had in the review up to now. And it seems that there's a sort of a particular way of doing trials in this area, which are falling short of the standards that we need for better evidence. As you can see, they've argued that it's not worth people doing small short-term crossover studies, which are dominating the ongoing studies that they've identified. In fact, what they probably need is one of the ones that they've picked out here as being particularly useful, and it's actually that's the design that they need to be initiated, rather than, if you like, more of the same. This is another example, and of people sort of using ongoing studies, and they just got straight to the point. This is a cracking way to write up an implications research section. I think just go straight for the jugular, right? Implications for research. 16 trials. This was from a recent review on COVID. So it's a living review, but actually this maybe elevates the importance of ongoing studies, actually, whereby if you have a number of studies which you know have been completed, or they've been terminated, or there are some that where the results have been registered, you know that the trials are ongoing, and you know the status of those studies, and you know will have some timeline as to when you think those results are likely to be available. It's important to really paste that, and actually what kind of flows off the back of this into the rest of this research section largely comes from what they've built up in terms of their intel about the ongoing studies first and foremost, and that helps to direct future efforts, either to sort of substantiate what's in the review or even away from it. And I think there is sort of a happy place that you can arrive at with implications for research, which are not about, you know, what more you need. You're thinking back to that quote from Doug in the first place. It's about the right research. It's often you need less research. In fact, there are times when you may even want people to stop. If you're pretty certain, and you can stand by that more studies just won't change the results or extend the generalizability of the evidence, actually what you can start doing is directing research resource, precious, you know, research funding towards more important and potentially more valuable areas. So it may be that you could retire the primary review, so the review that you're working on. You know, think about alternative questions. It may help you to refine focus. It may be that you want to look at alternative comparisons now, or you want to consider sort of longer term harms. And it may even be that the focus isn't so much on long-term effects. It may even be actually the most urgent question for us to try and work through is around implementation or equity. This is a review. It's obviously not a particularly recent one, but it's one that I think has been quite an important one, certainly through my career in Cochrane, because I remember the very sort of first versions of this review, which was looking at pulmonary rehabilitation in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. This review was updated and published, I think, in 2015. And the authors felt that it just wasn't worth going back to the well anymore. There'd sort of come a point where the review had effectively sort of been saturated in as many trials as were worth doing, and actually the real value now wasn't so much in you know, validating further in RCTs whether pulmonary rehabilitation had an impact on quality of life. Actually, the sort of the research priorities needed to flip to things that were potentially more much more worthwhile, where there was a lot more uncertainty. One was around subgroups and thinking through maybe things like severity or hospital admission or dose. The other factors that may help were things like uptake and persistence of the long-term effects. So actually, sort of closing off an area of research because you've reached the point where you don't need any more research is quite a good place to be, and it means that research effort can now go on to other things. So I'm going to sum up with some implications for research, and I've got 4 points I want to make here. Firstly, when you're writing this section, bank the uncertainties that you see emerging during the review process. You shouldn't have to do extra thinking at the end of the review. It should all have sort of been collected throughout that particular process. Don't assume that research implications should only be drawn on what you've got in your review as an included study. Take a stop to look at what's ongoing, because that will actually help refine those implications even further and be more useful to people, and it will stop waste. The third point is that some things are worth emphasizing over others, and the urgency or the sort of detail that you want to draw attention to, you need to go into, should be proportionate to the value of filling that research gap. So in all of the examples that I've shown you, some elements were worth emphasizing over others, and you don't want to bore people to death with 600 words in that section. So spend the words quite carefully, and think about the areas that are sort of most urgent to deal with, and think through the practicalities of it. Actually, how would rather than asking for low risk of bias studies, what is it that further study investigators can do to mitigate against sources of bias coming in, if they can? Not all of them can. And the last point is that sometimes it's not more research you need, it's just a change in the way that the research is being done. And that might be quite a fundamental thing. It might be that you've got there's poor agreement between research teams about different elements of population intervention, comparison, or definition of outcome. And that's where things like COMET are really useful, because they can drive up usage. It's an opportunity to remind people about the importance of core outcomes if they exist in that particular area, of course, and if they're worth taking up. And it may even be that you just want better or innovative study designs to help fill in those gaps. So it's not always more research you need, but it's always better research, and of course, research that's done for the right reasons. Thank you.